Thank you. And thanks for coming out. So again, as an introduction, my name is Brian Arnold. I teach photography in the School of Art and Design. And I'm just one of two or three faculty that I know of in the School of Art and Design that does not have a BFA, that does not have an undergraduate degree in art. And I spent my undergraduate education at the Colorado College in Colorado Springs. And I completed a major in English with a minor in ethnomusicology, which isn't a term or a discipline a lot of people know much about. But ethnomusicology, right, I see Luann back there. Ethnomusicology is a mix of anthropology and music. And as part of my undergraduate study, it keeps turning itself on spontaneously, sorry. As part of my undergraduate study, I went and lived in Indonesia for about 6 or 7 months, specifically in the island of Bali, which we'll see in greater detail as we go along. And my goal when I got out of college actually had nothing to do with photography. It was kind of after photography, or after college that I discovered photography. But my goal out of college was to study gamelan, so my decisions as to where to relocate and what to pursue as a job were based on whether I could play gamelan. And for those of you who don't know what that means, gamelan is a music tradition spread out throughout. I'm sorry that this keeps turning itself on. I'll just move it. How about that? Gamelan is a musical tradition that's you can find throughout Southeast Asia. But specifically refers to a style of percussion music that you find most prolifically in Bali and Java, which are our two islands down here. And it's an entirely unique form of percussion because the orchestras kind of range from 4 to 40 in terms of how many musicians participate. And it's largely built out of bronze, so it's a series of metallophones or xylophones and gong instruments. In fact, there are 2 Indonesian words that have become part of the English language, and one of them is gong. It's a Javanese word, actually. So yes, I'm going to talk about Indonesia, mostly talking about Indonesian music, but the one other kind of like little aside I want to throw in there is it kind of baffles me that our culture hasn't made more of a concerted effort to know more about Indonesia. Indonesia, as we know it today, much like the Middle East, is a byproduct of World War II. Prior to that, it was broken up into colonies ruled by the British, the Portuguese, or the Dutch. For a while, it was also conquered by the Japanese during World War II. But today, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. Recent counts have more Indonesians visiting Mecca for the annual pilgrimage than any other nationality. And it's also one of the 3 largest democracies in the world. In fact, the first democratically elected president of Indonesia was a woman. And our current president speaks Indonesian fluently. So it baffles me that we haven't tried to pursue a relationship with Indonesia, because Indonesia has embodied a lot of our political goals, or at least our foreign policy goals, the last 8 or 9 years. The title of my talk today is Lempad Gamelan in the West, a study of Indonesian music and Indonesian modernism. So as a little bit of a background, I'm mostly going to be talking about gamelan, the music traditions of Bali and Java, as I've studied them. But I'm also going to kind of talk about how I approach that as a literature major. And before I do any of that, I have one recording I'd like to play for you. It's really short, but this is a collection of Javanese instruments. So this would be a Javanese gamelan. And the recording that we're going to hear is Balinese, and there are some very distinct differences as well as some very distinct similarities. But I thought it'd be interesting just to spend a couple of minutes hearing what the music sounds like and seeing what the source of it is. So as I talk, over the next 45 minutes, we'll break that up a little bit more so you can hear or see a little bit more about what's going on. But that is about a collection of about 20 musicians playing a set of instruments that looks very much like this, as I said a minute ago, for those of you who just walked in. This particular collection of instruments has an interesting story behind it. It's actually owned by the Indonesian consulate in New York City and was built, I believe, in 1967 for the World's Fair in New York City. It's also perhaps worth noting that when I talk about gamelan, people will ask me, what instrument do you play? And I typically don't answer that because if I tell you I play demung or something like that, you won't really know what I'm talking about. But also, a gamelan in and of itself is one instrument. You can't take an instrument from one orchestra and bring it to another. It's tuned to itself, and each one of them is tuned uniquely. But ooh, that looks terrible. But I'd like to talk about how I got into that. So I said I was a literature major in college, and I was kind of dabbling with music. I played drums in a jazz band. I was studying like African drumming and dance, and as a literature major, I was hugely influenced by like the modernist writers, like the James Joyces and Carlos Williams, Virginia Woolf, that generation of authors. And I was a pretty good student, so by the end of my junior year, I pretty much finished my major. So I decided to spend most of my senior year abroad, and I was planning on going to West Africa to study some of the drumming that I had already started to discover on my own in the States. And as an adolescent, I think I spent a disproportionate amount of my time in used record stores. And I picked up this record, which is a recording that was made in the 60s, and one of the first recordings of Indonesian music that was mass-produced for a Western audience. And it was like an epiphany moment, right? Like as a photographer, there's this story that's often told about Harry Callahan, a very, very influential American photographer, who a self-taught photographer who used darkrooms at the Chrysler motor plant where he worked in his off hours to learn photography. And he saw his first Ansel Adams exhibit after he had been dabbling with photography, and he was blown away. He's like, I don't know what that is, but I know whatever that is, that's what I am too. And I had kind of a moment like that. I mean, I think all artists have them at some point, and probably more than once over the course, but it's just like something that kind of like rattles you to the core so much that it changes the direction. So I kind of liken it, what my experience of discovering this to that Callahan anecdote, because it's like I was so captivated by what I heard, which was actually the piece that I had going as many of you are walking in, that I just had to know more about where it came from. I was fortunate enough to have kind of a friend of a friend kind of thing, who was playing in a Balinese gamelan at that time, and he invited me to a rehearsal after he knew of some of these decisions. So, like I heard this recording, ditched the idea of going to the Ivory Coast, and decided to go to Bali instead for that study abroad. So I had an opportunity to sit in on some rehearsals with this group playing in Denver at the time, and the deal was sealed. But after I made that decision, being the kind of student that I was at the time, I kind of went back and I kind of looked at the modernist art traditions, kind of like in parallel with the literary traditions I had discovered, as kind of anticipation for what the study I was trying to prepare myself for in Indonesia. And there were 4 or 5 figures in particular that came up whom are all artists I actually still really admire today. The first one we're looking at is this guy named Colin McPhee, who was a Canadian, though lived most of his life in the United States. He was a pianist and a composer, and he's really the first known musician to have gone to the Dutch East Indies at that time. So it would have been about 1920. To study music, and he made some of the first known field recordings, like aluminum records of Balinese music. And he went ahead and transcribed it for piano, and actually even adapted some Balinese percussion, like gamelan percussion, to a full Western string symphony. He wrote a very influential book called Music in Bali. He's actually most well known, though, for his memoir, which he wrote shortly after he returned from. He lived most of his life in Bali, spent some time in Java. He served for about 12 to 15 years, and he wrote a memoir called House in Bali, which, interestingly enough, those of you who read The New Yorker, is an opera being staged in New York City right now. a unique opera that is orchestrated with both a Balinese percussion orchestra, a Balinese gamelan, and a traditional Western symphony. The second composer, I mean, kind of starting as a musician, or a quasi-musician, I don't really think of myself as a musician. Like, I can't really play many styles of music. I can't read music. But I really like to play. I like what it feels like, and it's a really important part of my creative self, I think. But this is another composer that I believe he taught at Lewis and Clark in Oregon in the 60s, named Lou Harrison, whom also kind of like as part of that kind of like hippie, mind-expanding culture, spent some time in Southeast Asia studying music. And he's really the first known Western musician to start incorporating Balinese and Javanese instruments with Western instruments. So he would make compositions for a Javanese metallophone called a gander and a French horn and a clarinet, things like that. And he just died recently. He's pretty active into the 90s. There are three types, in terms of understanding gamelan, there are three important cultural moments that happened in Indonesia. And I'll talk about two of them. I don't know much about the third of them, but those things are the Hindu-Buddhist Empire, which I will talk a little bit about today, the Dutch occupation, the Dutch colonialization of Indonesia, which I'll talk a little bit about today, and the coming of Islam. And I don't know much about the coming of Islam. I don't know much about Islam at all, actually. But Walter Spies was part of the Dutch colonial government. In fact, he was hired by a Dutch colonial regent outside of the city of Jakarta, which I'll talk more about. It's the city in central Java, probably in the 1930s. And he was hired to be like the government canteen, like the government watering hole pianist. So he earned his living as a pianist, but he considered himself a painter more. And Walter Spies is kind of like the Dutch Gauguin, for those of you who studied painting, where he was really interested in a lot of what was going on in European modernist painting. And he went to Bali and Java, spent most of his time in Java. And it was just like another one of those epiphanies where like he was able to start synthesizing some of the things that were going on with the symbolist painters and some of the other modernist traditions that were developing at that time with some of the imagery that he found in Balinese and Javanese pictorial traditions. I'm sorry these look so bad. So this would be a painting of like a Balinese rice paddy. This would probably be an illustration of one of the Hindu epics. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that also, like some of my research also led me to investigate this man, I Gusti Nyoman Lempad, which is a very complicated name. Those of you who know anything about Hinduism, within his name, his position in the Hindu class system is identified. So being Gusti means he's Kshatriya, which means he is one step short of religious enlightenment. Nyoman would be his birth order. The Balinese name their children by birth order. They have 1, 2, 3, 4. If you have 5 children, you have 2 number ones. And then Lempad would be his proper name. But he is kind of to Indonesian art what Picasso was to Western art. Like he was an incredible innovator. He's really well known in the West for his drawings, but within Indonesia he was known for his architecture. It's also worth noting that in much of Indonesia, and I can speak of this more confidently in talking about the the Hindu-Buddhist traditions rather than these Islamic traditions. Artistic power is akin to religious power. So we're actually looking at a photograph of Lempad. He was 113. This was taken shortly before he died. He prophesied his death like well in advance, like almost to the hour. But he was considered like a prophet. He was considered a Hindu mystic of the highest order. And you might see some similar kind of like pictorial strategies that were going on in European modernism. These would all be illustrations based on the Hindu epics. The 2 primary Hindu religious texts are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. I don't know exactly what these are illustrating. But they're really dreamy, they're really weird. It's mostly just pen and ink drawings. He did a little bit with gold leaf. Never like oil paints were introduced by people like Walter Spies and whatnot. So those would be kind of like a mid-20th century evolution in Indonesian arts. So this picture of Lempad was taken, as I said, he's 113 years old when this was taken. And this was probably the earliest, actually it's probably about 78 or 79. But I love his drawings. I think they're really animated and strange and not projecting so well. So this one I actually can't speak to. Would be an illustration from the Mahabharata, which is an essential Hindu story about the struggle of good and evil. And I said that Lempad is most well known in Indonesia as an architect. And he's kind of the founder of what is like common residential architecture in Bali. So you can't see this so well, but like any architecture in Bali is grounded on kind of like this temple hierarchy. And around all of like windows and doorways and things like that are always deemed kind of like portals where you have vulnerability. If you can come in, then anything can come in, seen or unseen. Right? It's a very animistic culture. So they carve like all these like Hindu figures into the concrete around the brick, and this would have, I mean, you see this all over Bali now, and this would have been one of Lempad's inventions. It's really beautiful, especially in context of the thick tropical jungle. But as I said, the Hindu-Buddhist tradition is important in understanding gamelan, and people say that, but nobody really knows why. There isn't much written history about Indonesia until the 19th century. It wasn't necessarily an Indonesian preoccupation to write things down as it is the Western academia or academics. But it's difficult to talk about Indonesia, I think, without talking about the incredible Hindu-Buddhist monuments, most notably Borobudur, which some of you might have heard about. Borobudur is often considered the 8th of the 7 man-made wonders of the world. It was built like in the 4th or 5th century, and it's remarkably well intact because it was buried under volcanic ash for centuries. Nobody knew it was really in existence, even Indonesians. There's lots of rumors. This Dutch archaeologist believed a lot of these rumors and spent tremendous amounts of money trying to find the location, and did so. So Borobudur was just unearthed like on the eve of World War II, after having been buried for centuries. So it has the distinction of being the largest Buddhist temple in the world. It's 13 stories tall. This would be a view from the top, which is just a series of these Buddhist stupas, overlooking this incredible volcanic valley. It's really gorgeous. But what I find most interesting about Borobudur is as you scale those 13 stories, if you were to walk the 13 stories in concentrically, clockwise, carved into the walls are the complete life history of the Buddha. So it's a pictorial story and remarkably well preserved. And about 50 miles away from the Hindu-Buddhist empire called the Majapahit, the only active residue in it is Bali. Bali is a Hindu province in an entirely Islamic nation. But the seat of the Hindu-Buddhist empire was in central Java, which I'll be talking more about in just a few minutes. But this would be the largest Hindu monument in Indonesia, and it's one of the 2 or 3 largest in the world. It's called Prambanan, and just outside of the Javanese city of Yogyakarta. And I just stick this in because I had just like a really spectacular afternoon there. This is a smaller Buddhist temple just outside of Prambanan, which is still like, I mean, Indonesia is a pretty poor country, and it's also it's really divisive. I mean, there are lots of islands other than just East Timor that would like to secede from the greater collective. But there's also kind of a strong sense of nationalism throughout Indonesia, so that they try to develop and preserve these monuments on their own. So I just had this really remarkable experience at this half-excavated Buddhist temple just outside of Prambanan called the Pleiadian Temples. And it's too bad you can't see that. That's the one photograph I have taken that's in the show, in this talk. Just a document of that great afternoon. But so my study, like that was kind of like preliminary research, right? Like I was really interested in modernist art, kind of followed that track. I heard this recording, and other than that, it was just kind of a leap of faith. I had no idea what I was getting into. And it was just like 6-7 months, but it was one of the most profound moments of my life, and I've since been to Indonesia a couple of times. But it all started in Bali, despite the fact that the recording that I heard was a document of a group in central Java. But I went to Bali. Bali, I think, is a remarkably interesting province in Indonesia. It's smaller than the state of Rhode Island, and it has a language and religion entirely indigenous to the island. And because of a lack of... Oh, sorry, that's my cell phone vibrating. I just have that there, for the clock. Because of a lack of written history, nobody really knows how that happens. How that happened. The Muslim government seated in Java has tried to make Hinduism illegal as a polytheistic religion, but the Balinese have been very persuasive in maintaining their identity. So I'm going to talk about the different forms of gamelan. In Bali, as I said, it's mostly in Bali and Java, but you can find forms of gamelan in Malaysia, Thailand, Borneo, another island in Indonesia, Sulawesi, which is where the tsunami was at the beginning of the week. But in Bali and Java, there's two primary tuning systems that are used for all of the different orchestras. So each orchestra is tuned to itself, but it's not like, we'll just make it up. There are some kind of structures that they use for tuning. So each one has a unique identity. Sorry. That's the voicemail. I couldn't do anything to change it. So each orchestra will have a voice of its own, but it's still based on the basic tuning structure. So before I start to identify some of the different ideas of the different Balinese orchestras and what they might represent, I'm going to play you a short recording of the different tuning systems. And I'll explain them quickly before I do that. So hundreds of musical traditions have been born out of two scales in Balinese and Javanese music. One is called Sulendro, S-U-L-E-N-D-R-O, which is essentially a whole tone scale, which means that as you go up the scale, the acoustic space between each note is approximately the same. And the second scale is called Pelag, which has two incidentals. So that'd be the equivalent of a black key in a piano. It'd be an equivalent of a sharp or a flat note, essentially. It's a 7-note octave, though typically in a Sulendro scale, because it's stretched out to be a whole tone, you don't have a whole octave. So it would be like a Sulendro scale. In Western music, we identify our pitches with letters, right, like A, B, C, D, etc. They do it with numbers, or the westernization of gamelan has done it with numbers. Indonesians just do it by phonetically. So a Sulendro scale would go 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 1, back to the octave. And a Pelag scale would have the two incidentals of 4 and 7, but they're still both 7-tone octaves. So we're going to listen to what those two tuning systems sound like. The first one is Sulendro. And again, the recording I'm going to give you is a Javanese tuning while we're looking at a Balinese orchestra, but it's the same idea. The physical structure of the instrument would be a little bit different because a Javanese Sulendro goes 6, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 1, when a Balinese would just go 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. So we're going to hear 6, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 1. And then there'll be a slight pause. You'll hear the second scale. You should be able to hear the two kind of sharp notes of the 4 and 7 pretty easily. So this is the Pelag scale. Here's your first incidental. Okay, so if any of you have ever heard or seen gamelan before, it's most likely you've seen a Balinese gamelan gong kebyar, which is a style and a tuning that was kind of developed in the second half of the 20th century. It's based on the Pelag tuning. Kebyar differs from a lot of other Balinese, like most Balinese and Javanese orchestras, each instrument has only one octave. And you'd be surprised at how complicated the melodies and rhythms can get with such a limited melodic and rhythmic space. But part of the difference in a gong kepiar is that it opened up to 2 octaves. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, so on up to 7 a second time. The way all Balinese, like one of the similarities between Balinese and Javanese music is it's kind of like, I was thinking about this last night, it's kind of like fractals, for those of you who study traditions outside of aesthetics, where you're taking something basic and dividing it into smaller subdivisions. That's always the same identity and the same pattern as that basic structure, but always a little bit more elaborate, or repeating it a few more times. So what we're looking at in this picture would be kind of a visual description of what a Balinese gong kepiar would look like. The primary root structure is always the gong. Gongs are used to mark beat cycles. A gong will chime whenever a pattern is repeated or whenever it's time to move on to another pattern, which will make a little bit more sense in just a minute. And then situated right next to the gongs, you would have your first bass instrument, which would be playing just like melody just on direct pulses, right? And then in front of that, you would have one of the elaborating instruments. The elaborating instruments are the things that usually capture people's attention, particularly with Balinese music. Like I said, one of the similarities is the tuning systems. The difference is that Balinese music is incredibly extroverted and incredibly fast and dynamic. Javanese music is really meditative and slow and patient and subtle and really nuanced. So to explain and demonstrate how this works, I'm going to show you just like a minute-long YouTube clip. Bronze, as you can imagine, is an incredibly resonant material, right? Just like a cymbal, like if you play drums, like it'll ring for a long time. But if you put that over like a hollow cavity, a hollow resonator, then you can hit it and it'll ring for a minute or two. So the technique is also really interesting to watch. There would be no such thing as a left-handed person in Bali that wouldn't tolerate that. So the left hand is always used to stop a key after you've played it. So you're playing with your right hand, and you're playing, and you're stopping the key with the left hand. I'm going to show you this and explain what's going on more specifically. The primary characteristic of Balinese music is this interlocking melodic pattern where you're subdividing the primary melody, the primary elaborating melody, rather than just like that basic melody that's coming from the gong and the bass instruments. But like once you get to the higher registers, you're doing this really complicated rhythmic and melodic interlocking, where each one of the players is playing half of the melody. And you can see if you're watching their mallets closely, they're going by pretty quickly. They're striking in complete opposition, so that you're stopping the key that you're playing while the other person opposite you is striking the key, so that you have a sense of a fluid melody. None of this is improvised. A lot of people think it is because it's like, so like, how could you look at it the other way? Also, none of it's notated. It's all taught orally, and it's all memorized. I'm pleased to say we watch this a lot in my house. My 3-year-old son loves that video. If we go back to our slideshow, there's another really unique instrument that almost looks like horizontal gongs in the front, which is called a rayong, which plays another really elaborate sort of melodic subdivision that is done by a similar sort of interlocking. That type of interlocking is called kotekan, so you saw that word come up at the beginning of that video. The way kotekan are usually identified, like if those of you who've studied Western music, right, like if you have your primary pulse and you divide that pulse into 4 different beats, we would call that sixteenths. So what's going on in that particular video is that you have each player is playing 2 of those 4/16ths. One of them would be playing the 2/16ths that line up with the pulse directly. The other one would be playing the 2/16ths that fall off the primary beat, which is much more complicated than it even sounds, and it sounds pretty complicated. So those 2 parts are distinguished. One is called polos, which is the one that lines with the beat, and the other one is called songse, which would also be used to describe what you're about to see here. So the kind of horizontal gongs called rayong is one instrument that will be played by 4 musicians. It spans 2 octaves. And basically the part is doubled every other person. So figure 1 here on the right, you'll see he's obviously leading this particular part. And 2 seats down, they'll be doubling the same part on the octave. While the 2 other ones would be doing the songse part, the part that falls off the beat that interlocks with it. This instrument, unlike the last instrument we just saw, which is called the gongsa, is played with 2 hands. The gongs, the rayongs, will ring just as long as the bronze key suspended over the hollow resonator. But because you're playing with 2 hands, it's a little bit trickier to stop. So what you might not see, but is really remarkable, for each note that the musician plays, you're actually striking the pot twice. The second one is to stop the ringing of the first stroke. So it's kind of a bounce stroke. It's more like it's like a solid wood stick that's wrapped in cotton. So it's a slightly warmer sound. It's not quite as percussive. I said gong kebiar was a style of, it's a 20th century invention. It's kind of like, this would be Stravinsky of the Balinese world. And it's really characterized by speed and power. Like that's not necessarily characteristic of all Balinese music, but it's really captivating because of that, and it's really fun to play because of that. And I'm going to show you one more short clip before we go on to the rest of the slides I have together. So I explained this melodic equation. I should speed this up a little bit. I explained this melodic equation, like the interlocking, the kotekan that the metallophones were playing at the beginning. That happens with each and every part, and as I said, with the metallophones, they're dividing one beat into 4/16ths. I'm going to show you an example of the kendong playing. Kendong is a hand drum. They're doing the same thing, but dividing a beat into 8 parts. And in this particular video, so we call that 30 seconds. So there would be 8 subdivisions to one primary pulse, right? You're putting 8 notes in between that pulse. And each one of the drummers is playing the exact same part, but 1 30 seconds off of the other to create this really intricate pattern. A minute ago, like I described gamelan as fractals. Like if you start with just like this gong beat, which happens like every 8 pulses or something like that, you're constantly dividing it to something smaller until you get to that note. And this particular characteristic of gong kebiar, its most finite expression of that subdivision would be that 30-second drum interlocking. When I say 30 seconds, I'm characterizing the rhythmic subdivision. Okay, so one of the primary ways that Balinese differs from Javanese, other than kind of like that speed and dynamism, is there are also a lot more varieties of Balinese gamelan. So gong kebiar is used a lot for entertainment and dance, and there's some particular theatrical traditions that have grown up around it. The genre or the style of Balinese music I have the most proficiency or experience with is what we call gamelan angklung. This is the cylindro tuning. But if you look at these instruments, every instrument in this orchestra just has 4 pitches. You don't even have a full octave. It just goes 1, 2, 3, 5. It is used more for like religious services or something like that. But it's still played in it's a different style to an educated ear, but would still have like that kind of subdivision that you just saw with the YouTube videos. One of the things that I find, like, a lot of people ask me about when they know that I've been to Indonesia, like, oh, have you ever seen the shadow plays? Which are really amazing and really impenetrable for somebody like me to understand. But the music that goes with it is really amazing. It's a quartet called Gender Wayan, spelled like gender but pronounced Gender, that are playing the same interlocking. This is an exceedingly difficult instrument to play. We witnessed, like if you were listening closely in that first video that I showed you, one of the players missed one of the keys with his left hand, and you can hear it ring like almost through the rest of the video if you're watching it closely. You still have that same problem. You can see that each one of the musicians in this particular ensemble is playing with 2 hands. It's 4 people, but they still, Balinese, like they're very baroque. They like a really full sound. So each musician is playing with 2 hands. The mallet is used with 3 fingers, and the other 2 fingers are used to dampen the key. And so this is, again, tuned in cylindro, but you would have a 2-octave range. So you go 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. The Balinese shadow theaters they were really popular with postmodern scholars, like in the 80s and 90s. Linguistically, they're so incredibly complicated. Like there are these stories based on the Hindu epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, that are told in a number of languages simultaneously that most Indonesians don't know. But that really captivated the postmodern scholars. So a Dalang would be fluent in this language called Kakawian, which is a Sanskrit derivative, and Kidung, which was an attempt to make Kakawian a spoken language, as well as Balinese and Javanese and Indonesian. And each one of these languages has a really specific hierarchical function and relates a different meaning in terms of how we perceive reality. And the puppeteer is called dalangs. They're often considered like, in addition to being really accomplished artists, because they have to be able to play this music, tell these stories, speak all these languages. But because of that, I said that there's a direct connection in Indonesian thinking between creative and artistic proficiency and kind of mystical or religious expression. Dalangs are also considered priests. Like a dalang, a puppeteer, can consecrate holy water, for instance. And I was going to play you a clip of this music, but there's some other things I'd like to talk about. I'm kind of running short of time. But this would be an example of what a Balinese shadow play would look like. There, you have a bright light with the puppeteer behind it, projecting these images made from leather puppets onto the screen with this gamelan orchestra that he's conducting, playing behind him to help articulate the motifs of the story. I'm actually going to go briefly over some of the older forms of Balinese gamelan. That first recording that I played you, that 3-minute recording, is from an orchestra called the Semar Pegulingan, which is also based on a Pelag scale. So it's a 7-note orchestra. And it's one of the older forms like that. Well, I won't say that. That first composition I played you, that 2 or 3-minute composition, was probably written in the mid-19th century. Semar Pegulingan it was probably developed in the late 18th century and really was at its peak in the 19th century. It was originally made as a devotional to the Hindu goddess of love and was only to be played when the king wanted to have sex. So it's music for making love. Another really, this is really fun to play, because it's all rhythm, it's no melody. Like Balinese have a very complicated religious structure, and music is a part of every religious expression. There's a lot of like marching bands and stuff like that that are still like that's kind of like it's relegated to football fields here, but marching bands are all over the place. Like you can be going out to lunch and you'll have to wait 40 minutes while this band walks down the street. And it's all just cymbals and percussion instruments. It's called gamelan balaganjar. It's really fun to play. And I'm going to quickly just talk or mention the two oldest forms of Balinese gamelan as a segue into Javanese. As I said, Bali is a largely Hindu province in the Muslim nation of Indonesia. But there is a small Muslim community in Bali that has their own form of gamelan called selending, which is also a four-note orchestra based on the cylindro scale, and is remarkably different in its timbre, which would be, as a kind of musical term, that's kind of like color, or like color values or tonalities. So a timbre would refer to the color of the sound, so to speak. So it's got a really different timbre because it's made out of iron instead of bronze. And then probably the oldest form of Balinese gamelan is called gong gede, which just means big gong. It's probably the most like Javanese. So I think this picture is made by Margaret Mead, a British anthropologist who spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. So this would have been made around 1920. And I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about Java. I might not get all the way through the slides, so that I have a few minutes to take questions as well. Javanese gamelan, like there are two or three varieties of Javanese gamelan that I know of. But when we speak of Javanese gamelan, kind of like in the field, so to speak, we're typically referring to a style of music that comes from these two cities right here, Yogyakarta and Solo. Solo is typically called Surakarta, which it was the seat of the Hindu-Buddhist Empire. So Borobudur is just outside those two cities, as is Prambanan. And that's all I'm really going to talk about. I don't know anything about Sudanese gamelan or anything to that effect. Another one of the primary differences between Balinese and Javanese music is like each Balinese orchestra is just one thing, just one scale. It's either pelog or cylindro. That's it. Each Javanese orchestra actually has both of those scales built into it. So if you look at this, like each instrument playing session is an L. All of the keys facing to the front, the gongs are situated in the back. Each of the keys facing to the front would be the cylindro scale. Each of the keys facing up to the side would be the pelog scale. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I miscalculated time. Okay. So the cities Surakarta and Yogyakarta are kind of important in the history of gamelan. When the Dutch came, they had kind of a divide and conquer mentality. So they took the royal family that was in seat in Java and divided it into two different houses, which originally kind of expressed their conflict in arms through some pretty bloody feuds, but eventually kind of expressed it in the arts, so that through the two different courts in Surakarta and Yogyakarta, different music and art traditions really started to blossom. And this happened like in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is when much of like your traditional Javanese gamelan repertoire would have been written. So this would have been the king's abode in the Javanese city of Solo or Surakarta. And this would have been the royal house in Yogyakarta, which is actually now the seat of the Sultan of Java, which is it's like an Islamic political seat. I can go through these really quickly, and then I'll take questions for a couple minutes before people have to leave. As I said, just like Balinese music, Javanese music is divided like fractals into smaller and smaller parts. A Balinese orchestra will typically have one gong, sometimes two. Javanese will have a lot, and each one of these is used to mark different melodic changes or rhythmic changes or passages in time as you go from section A to section B. So this is the gong, the foundation of the melody. The smaller gongs are called kampul, so they would mark different moments of time. Another melodic subdivision is a horizontal gong, like the rayong that you saw, though this would be played like a gong, really sparingly. So depending on what the form of the music is, the gong might play once every 200 beats or something like that, or it might play one every 8 beats. If it's playing like every 200 beats, it wouldn't be 200, it's always going to be a subdivision of 4 or 8. You would have these gongs chime in between so that the musicians, because none of it's really written, which I'm going to contradict a little bit later if I have time to get that far, these would be markers for the musicians to know how much of the melodic time has passed. The melody of a Javanese orchestra is called a balungan, in contrast to the kotekan that we talked about with Balinese. So these are the primary balungan instruments, kind of going from bass to treble, demung, saron, and peking. This is an instrument called bonang, which is very similar to the rayong that you saw, though it's played really, really slowly. I have a video clip I was going to show you, but I'm going to pass on that because I've mismanaged time. It's played really slowly, but it would be played like that polo songse relationship you saw in the kotekan that I showed you, where one player would be playing bonang, the other player is playing a series of instruments that look like a bonang. It's called the bonang panorus. It's tuned an octave up. Would be playing the same part as the bonang player, but would be playing it twice as often and be playing it on the offbeats. This is a Javanese gender. So the gender in Balinese music is just used for one orchestra in the shadow play. All Javanese gamelan have a gender in it. It's a two-handed metallophone. Something you also see in Javanese that you don't see in Balinese is this wooden xylophone called a gambang. Both orchestras are melodically accented with a suling. If you were listening, you heard that in that first take that I played for you. Another difference with Balinese and Javanese is the rebab, a bowed lute, which is believed to have derived from influence from Persian instruments as well as Chinese instruments. And another huge difference is in Balinese and Javanese is there's very, very, very minimal choral or vocal tradition in Balinese, but it's a huge part of Javanese. So I'm going to play you another really short clip, and then I'll just stop it there and take questions. That will show you or demonstrate for you what the suling, the bamboo flute, sounds like. The rebab, which is a two-string bowed lute, kind of like a violin or a cello or something like that. And you'll also hear a little bit of the Javanese vocal technique, which is really different. A lot of people don't like it. It took me, quite truthfully, it took me a long time to learn to like it because it uses such a different part of your vocal structure. So rebab is often used to introduce a piece. This would be like the head of a jazz clip, like telling the musicians what's being played. If you hear that light, warm chime sound, that's the gender. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, and I am happy to stay for another 5 or 10 minutes if people have questions. Sorry that I overestimated how much I could fit into this time.